Having extracted the King Era allegory from Revelation 6, I was left with two other allegories to crack. What tipped me off to the existence of these allegories was primarily the bow. I missed it the first time I went through, and I wasn't sure what would happen if I extracted it. I was highly skeptical of this path. However, it turned out that extracting those parts was a very good thing. First, I'd like to talk about Allegory 2. The parts of this allegory are the bow, the sword, the scales, Hades, the altar, the sun turns black, and the moon turns red. I was certainly hoping to get something out of these references. In astronomy, I was familiar with the scales being a reference to constellation Libra, and after a quick Google search, I confirmed that Sagittarius carries a bow. I wasn't sure about the rest, so I started looking up constellation references. Hades is Hyades, the V-shaped constellation, a part of constellation Taurus, and the toughest one to find would be the altar. The altar is constellation Ara, and Ara is a somewhat rare constellation. It's so far south that it's rarely seen in the northern hemisphere. The sword could be ambiguous, so I have to find the other constellations to know which sword I'd be talking about. Now, on the sun turning black, the only event I can think of is an eclipse, so I started researching eclipses. I found one source on NASA's website that lists famous eclipses, and only one of those eclipses matches the era of Nero. On April 30th, 59 CE, a total eclipse passed straight through this area and encompassed all possible positions that I'd hoped for. This event was described by Pliny the Elder. He said it darkened the 14 districts of Rome. Even though the total eclipse was far south of the city, a partial eclipse could be seen in Rome. On the NASA website, it gave locations for the eclipse by Universal Time or Greenwich Mean Time. Unfortunately, this doesn't tell me where the stars were 2,000 years ago, so I found another site called yoursky.com. On this site, you can see the stars and planets by location, time, and date. And first I wanted to take a look at the nighttime sky, so I set the time for the night before the eclipse at 8 p.m. Jerusalem, April 29th, 59 CE. This is a star chart for that night. Notice Libra the scales are here. Now, one thing you can barely see in this star chart is Hades, the Hyades constellation. Hyades appears only for a short time on the horizon, just after the sun goes down. This is a picture of what Hades would have looked like at 8 p.m. on the 29th from Jerusalem. It's dark enough to show up, but it won't be there for long. I knew the altar, constellation Ara, might be difficult to find, so I went ahead a few hours. At 1 a.m. on the 30th, Ara appears in the south. Going ahead a few more hours at 4 a.m., Ara and Sagittarius appear. You can barely see it on this chart, but as I zoom in on the upper right corner, constellation Perseus appears carrying his sword. Oddly, at the same time, at 4 a.m., Hades, or the Hyades constellation, would have reappeared. The night begins and ends with Hades. The sword, the altar, the bow, and the scales all show up this night. So Allegory 2 seems to be a seasonal reference. It's describing the constellations that could be seen at a specific time of year. So moving ahead, let's see what the eclipse looked like on the following day. Back on the NASA website, you can find the time that it passed through different areas. Setting this as close to Jerusalem as possible, here are the times for the event. So I went and plugged in the maximum eclipse time into my star chart. The time would be about 13:30 Greenwich Mean Time, which would also be around 4:30 in the afternoon in Jerusalem. Notice this is during maximum eclipse. The first 5 colored dots are planets. And after breaking down the planetary symbols they use on this chart, we get Jupiter, Saturn, Mars, Mercury, and Venus. All 5 would have likely been visible during the total eclipse, and all 5 were known to ancient astronomers. The easiest of the 4 horsemen to explain would be Mars. This would be the fiery red horse. The white horseman was probably Jupiter or Saturn, and I'm leaning heavily toward Jupiter because of the reference of riding out, and because Jupiter is easily seen. Saturn would not have been so bright, and was likely difficult to see. The pale horseman was probably Venus. It would have been highly visible but yellowish. This only leaves the black horseman. Using another tool on yoursky.com and plugging in the correct time and dates, Mercury would have been visible from the Earth. Whether or not this ends up black is in the eye of the beholder. Staring at a solar eclipse is not a good idea. The sun turns black for sure. You can observe that simply by looking at the resulting darkness around you. But the only way to observe the moon is to look at it. And as anyone who has happened to get a glimpse of the sun knows, a red image will burn onto your retinas. Looking at anything from that point on gives you a red image. The moon doesn't turn blood red, but if you feel like sacrificing your eyes during a solar eclipse, the moon will definitely appear reddish. Curiously, one other thing shows up in this star chart. Hades once again rears its ugly head. Relatively speaking, the solar eclipse happened in the location of the constellation Hyades. Hades appears 3 times in these charts, so somewhere in there, Hades did indeed follow close behind. So the third allegory, the 4 horsemen, is probably a reference to 4 planets. The red horseman is probably Mars, the white horseman is probably Jupiter, the pale horseman is probably Venus. I believe the black horseman is probably Mercury, but again, it depends on the damaged eyes of whoever is looking at it. Mercury would have been bright, but it would have been very close to the sun's corona. When combined with the first 2 allegories, something interesting happens. We get 3 allegories pointing to one single event. We get a description of the time or king era in which the event occurred, the season in which the event occurred, and a depiction of the event itself. It occurred in the era of Nero, in spring as depicted by the stars, and the event was a solar eclipse with 4 planets appearing in the Hades constellation. The only loose ends to tie up are linguistic in nature. For example, the word earthquake in ancient Greek is seismos. Even though Bible translators use this as earthquake nearly every time it comes up, it's the least likely definition. It's far more likely to mean a shaking or commotion, and a solar eclipse would definitely cause a commotion, so much of a commotion that the author wrote a book about it. The book of Revelation is also called the book of Apocalypse. The ancient Greek word apocalypse means unveiling or lifting the veil. The earth was plunged into darkness, but it would end. The veil of the sun would be lifted, and life would go on. Given the 3 allegories, I believe I have a solid case for all of chapter 6. The author appears to be describing a single event, an eclipse, and giving 2 time references to explain when the eclipse happened. It took a long time to break down the allegories, but the final picture of Revelation 6 is pretty cool.